Rodin gives us a morality tale where he explores human frailty and the consequences of human sin. He turns the human body, both physically and morally, inside out. The structure for Rodin's Gates of Hell comes, paradoxically, from a sculpture called the Gates of Paradise. He's been to Italy, and like many people, he was bowled over by the work of Lorenzo Ghiberti, whose bronze gates of Paradise adorned the baptistry in Florence. Now, like Ghiberti, Rodin begins with 8 individual bronze panels, but very quickly, this changes from 8 into 2. And what we have is a rather seething, pulsating mass of humanity, where everything seems to fuse into one entity. But if we start from the top, that's the key, I think, or the keystone to the entire work. Rather than just having one figure, Rodin replicates one figure 3 times in what are called the 3 shades, or shadows. These are ghostly presences, or spectres, that hover above the gates. Their hands aren't really visible, just fists that point us down into what is there below. And then the most iconic image in the entire gate, the thinker, Dante himself, the poet, contemplating and presiding over his creation, this horrifying mass below, but also Rodin's alter ego, Rodin himself as the creator. And so important was the image of the thinker for Rodin that he scaled it up and had it as an individual sculpture in various guises, the most important of which was on his own tomb. And then, from the thinker at the apex, the forms seem to emerge. We can pick out various ones, not least Ugolino, a 13th century Pisan tyrant who was locked up in a tower, condemned to starve to death, and in turn ate his own children. And you can see Rodin showing the bestial side of Ugolino as he's on all fours, like an animal, crouched above his poor children that he's about to devour. There are more biblical figures. There are extraordinary acrobatic figures. There's also this amazing feeling when you stand in front of the gates of closeness and intimacy, as well as seeing small-scale figures from huge distance, where it seems as if some of the figures have been rammed into the door and others have been pulled out. And there's a fantastic sense of spontaneity here, of a man working frenetically, as he did for the first 4 or 5 years of this work, with his clay and with his plaster. And there's also a sense of a man collaging elements. We know that Rodin made hundreds of freestanding sculptures, parts of which he then assembled and added to other figures to create what we see here. Ultimately, the Gates of Hell is the greatest public sculpture of the 19th century, indeed of the last 200 years. But it's also a private laboratory for Rodin, where you can see his creative imagination running riot. And in effect, it becomes a repository from which some of the greatest, most important and most iconic sculptures of his entire career emerge. The idea of the Gates of Hell as some kind of creative laboratory for Rodin is nowhere better exemplified than with this work, The Kiss. But in fact, this image is so ecstatically happy and upbeat that Rodin felt that it had no place in the tumultuous horrors of the Gates of Hell, and so it evolved as a sculpture in its own right. And it depicts the moment in a story that was reputed to have happened, that Dante heard about and incorporated into his Divine Comedy, where 2 people, Francesca di Rimini and Paolo Malatesta, who are brother and sister-in-law, but who gradually and slowly fall in love, and who, when they read books of courtly love, are so overcome with passion that they push the book to one side and start to embrace. And allegedly, that's the moment that Rodin has captured. I say allegedly because you can see the book behind Paolo's hand, but the idea that this somehow is spontaneous love is clearly spurious. What are these 2 people doing naked if they're reading demure sagas of courtly love together? So we can push that in a way to one side. It's a wonderful romantic ideal. But what Rodin is really getting at is both ideal beauty, but the beauty and the pleasure of sensual, erotic coupling. It's one of the most erotic works of the 19th century to many people, and it struck an extraordinarily broad chord, because there's a tragedy here too. Because after this moment of embrace, the two lovers are discovered by Francesca's husband and Paolo's brother, and his reaction is extreme. He murders them brutally, and then, in Dante's Divine Comedy, they are consigned forever to hell because of their forbidden love. And for these universal reasons, the fact that the work seems to, in various ways, have struck a universal chord, the French state, within 3 years, commissioned a version of the kiss, and then other cities in Europe also got their versions, and very quickly the work became one of the most reproduced that's ever been made. Aside from the mass reproduction of his work, using a pointing machine, the other radical aspect of Rodin's sculptural production, developed in the 1890s, was that of assemblage. Instead of creating a single body, he would produce various arms, legs, hands, which were then used in various combinations later on. This process of accretion, of bringing together various elements to make sculpture, became one of the dominant methods of the 20th century. With Rodin, its often unacknowledged father. In 1884, Rodin received a public commission backed by public subscription to fund it from the people of Calais to commemorate an extraordinary event which had taken place back in 1347 and had been chronicled by a writer called Jean de Froissart. What had happened was that the English had besieged the city of Calais for 11 months, and finally the city fell. But, led by Eustache de Saint-Pierre, 5 other burghers sacrificed themselves to the English, along with the keys of the city, in order to save the rest of the inhabitants. And it's that event that Rodin is commemorating. Now, the burghers of Calais in the 19th century wanted Rodin to produce a pyramidal sculpture with Eustache de Saint-Pierre heroically at the top. But what Rodin wanted to do was commemorate all 6 men, whose names had only just been discovered the decade before. Now, in order to be as authentic as possible, Rodin used local models from the region and also began by making life-size studies of them naked in order to get the naturalism as close as possible, and also to produce a kind of scaffolding on which he could then clothe the figures, also life-sized, and produce the finished monument. Then there was a whole battle about how the work should be displayed, which was scuppered in a way by a financial problem which saw funds run out. So for 2 or 3 years after he'd started to make the work, he showed individual sculptures, and then